Hi, my name is Matt Fradd, and I am really honored to have been invited to speak today about the problem of pornography and how we can begin to heal from it. I want to share with you a few myths about pornography to begin with, myths that even many Christians believe, and I'll show why they're false. Then I want to share with you two really helpful strategies when trying to overcome pornography. These were two strategies that when I discovered them, I found them immensely helpful, and they've also proven helpful in the lives of those that I've worked with. And then finally, I want to share with you three really helpful resources for when overcoming pornography. I should say from the outset that this is not a talk just for men or just for young people. This is a talk for everybody because many people struggle with pornography in all walks of life, be they male or female, young or old, religious or not religious. And so I really pray that this will be a help. For the last 10 years, I've traveled the country and internationally speaking almost exclusively on this topic of pornography. I've written books about it, developed courses on it, and so I think I've got some good things to share, and I hope that you'll agree with that by the end of this talk. Let's begin with a couple of myths about pornography. Now, the first myth is one that you immediately know is a myth if you're a Christian, okay? And the myth is that pornography is wrong because there is something wrong with sex or sexual desire or just nudity. Now, as I say, if you're a faithful Christian, you already know that this is false. And yet I think many people maybe still have this as a sort of a underlying reason for being suspicious of pornography. They are suspicious of sexual desire or the sexual act, and therefore say, well, maybe pornography is wrong because there's an overemphasis on sex or something like that. Likewise, enemies of Christians who wish to paint those who speak about pornography from a negative point of view as sort of religious zealots, they'll also say this. They'll say, well, the reason you're against porn is because you were raised in some weird religious home, and that's why you're against it. So it's important that we address this because when we're trying to show why pornography is evil, we don't want to make the mistake of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So let me say three things real quick. The problem with pornography is not sex, and it is not sexual desire, and it is not nudity. In fact, I would say it's the exact opposite. So it's not like porn is wrong because these things are wrong. Rather, it's porn is wrong because these three things are really good. Sex is actually the first commandment from God to humanity in the Bible. Don't believe my word for it. Feel free to look it up yourself. Genesis chapter 1, verse 28. God says, "Be fruitful and multiply." And as Dr. Peter Kraft once quipped, I do not think by that he meant grow grapefruits and invent calculators. He meant have sex, he meant have babies and fill the world. Sex is good. In fact, if it weren't good, you couldn't make it bad. Do you understand what I mean? If it weren't beautiful, you couldn't make it ugly. You can't make things that are already ugly, ugly. Like if I had a pile of trash next to me, and I said, look at how ugly this is, and you agreed, and then I kicked it over and then said, now look at it, it's still ugly. Very beautiful things, though, can be made very ugly. And I think the fact that sex can be made very ugly is an indirect proof that we should think that it ought to be very beautiful. When two people come together and give of themselves and receive one another, as it were, and new life is created from this, or even if it isn't, this is a very, very, very beautiful thing, the most sacred thing. I mean, if sex was not the most sacred thing that two people could engage in, what on earth would it be? Doing the dishes together? Walks on the beach? Sharing a bed with another person? I mean, these things one could do with a sibling or a good friend or somebody of the same sex. But surely it's the sexual act that is the foundational stone upon which society is built. If you get rid of sex, you get rid of marriage, you get rid of the family, you get rid of society. So sex is so good, we revere it, it is actually holy, and this is precisely why pornography is wicked. That's right, evil. The problem with pornography isn't sexual desire. You ought to be experiencing sexual desire. Sexual desire is a God-given gift that ought to propel us to make a gift of ourselves according to the demands of love and prudence. Sometimes people will maybe think of sexual desire as if it were somehow a sign that one has not advanced in holiness. If only I would pray more rosaries or bathe in holy water. I'm pretty sure nobody says that, but I'm being silly, you know what I mean? But no. Sexual desire is a sign that something's going right. And in fact, we should say that strong sexual desire is not the same thing as lust. It's not synonymous with it. Sometimes people think that it is and say, how can I ever be sexually pure? I have all these desires. Okay, the desires aren't the problem. Lust is a distortion of sexual desire. Lustful actions are actions in which we engage in sexual activity in an inappropriate way. But sexual desire is a good thing. Finally, we should say that the body is good. If the body wasn't good, you couldn't degrade it. If it didn't have any grade to begin with, you couldn't degrade it. We don't talk about degrading, bottle caps and phones. We do talk about degrading human beings because we think that human beings have sort of intrinsic worth, unalienable rights. Put it however you want, but we just think that the human person is special because of who they are, and that specialness isn't bestowed upon them by others or by society. And so the reason pornography is wrong, again, is because it reduces the sort of mystery and complexity of the human person to a sort of two-dimensional object for my selfish gratification. And the body is the person. I mean, you don't have a body. You are a body. You are body and soul. Both are equally a part of who you are. Think about the absurdities that would result if you weren't your body. Well, if you weren't your body, if your body was somehow distinct from who you are, then the body would be like a cage or a machine or something like that. Which would mean that when I kiss my daughter goodnight, I'm not actually kissing my daughter goodnight. Rather, since I'm not my body, I'm manipulating the husk, which is not me, and pressing it against the husk, which is not her. This is absurd. If we aren't our bodies, then you should never say, he slapped me. You should say, he used the thing that wasn't him to hit the thing that wasn't me. Well, no one's come into contact with each other then. You are your body, and the body is good. And this is another reason that pornography is evil. It's been said that the problem with pornography is not that it shows too much, but that it shows far too little of the human person. It, as I said already, reduces the person, treats him or her merely as a means to an end. And this is always wrong. All right, here's another myth I think people believe about pornography, and that is that basically, maybe you'd say, or the objector would say, religious people have reasons that don't necessarily show that they are against sex, but nevertheless, this is definitely a religious thing, like non-religious people, surely they're for porn, at least in moderation. Well, this isn't true. Over the last 40 years, there's been a ton of research that's come out from different branches of science, from neurology, sociology, psychology, and all of it is saying quite unambiguously that porn is destructive, that it's bad for our emotional and mental health, even for our physiological health, which we'll maybe get into a little later on, that it's bad for society. And as this science has come out of academia, as it's trickled down the ivory towers of academia, as it were, to the riffraff, me and you maybe, I don't want to accuse you of being the riffraff, you see, but certainly me, more people are beginning to speak out against pornography. People that we wouldn't expect to speak out against pornography. People like Kanye West, or comedian Chris Rock, or actor, former NFL player Terry Crews, or former Playboy bunny Pamela Anderson, or the lead singer of Metallica, James Hetfield, who narrated a documentary against pornography called Chasing the Cardboard Butterfly. Many people are beginning to speak out against pornography, and not for religious reasons. In fact, some of the biggest, I would say the biggest, anti-porn sites and movements on the web are non-religious ones. FightTheNewDrug.com would be an example, or YourBrainOnPorn.com. Your Brain on Porn is actually run by a friend of mine. His name's Gary Wilson, not a religious man. In fact, he said to me that he is left of Bernie Sanders, which is pretty impressive when you think about it. I want to show you his website here, YourBrainOnPorn.com. This is his website, and here, as you can see, he lists the relevant research concerning pornography's detrimental effects. And so, check this out. There are currently 55 neuroscience-based studies on porn users. All but one support the addiction model. That is to say that their findings mirror the neurological findings reported in substance addiction studies. So if you were to click this link here on yourbrainonporn.com, it'll take you to the actual, it'll give you an excerpt of the study. You can click through to the university's website and get it if you like. But this is pretty great, all right? So there's a lot of research now that's come out concerning this. And I think sometimes when people hear that pornography is addictive, they may have a negative reaction to that. They may say to themselves, okay, you're just using the word addiction to avoid responsibility. If you can claim to be a victim, then you don't have to change your life. Well, I would say to that, just because a word can be abused, it doesn't mean it can't also be used correctly. And as I say, these 50, when people say that porn's not addictive, I think what they mean is it's not a substance you bring into your body, that you can be so dependent on that if you weren't to have it, you would die. But, okay, well, I suppose it does depend on how we define addiction, but put it this way, right? I'm a layman, right? I did a lot of research when writing my book, The Porn Myth. Okay, so maybe I know a lot more about the neuroscience of pornography than others, but I'm still an amateur. I know this much, and I think you would agree that, okay, well, if somebody's addicted at least to a substance, say like cocaine or methamphetamines, okay, obviously some deterioration is taking place in the brain. You can't expect to engage heavily in a drug like those, or even alcohol or nicotine, and it have no impact on your brain. Okay, so what I'm saying is these 54 neuroscience-based studies mirror the neurological findings reported in substance addiction studies. So we've got really good reason, without getting into it, to think that pornography is addictive. All right, now check out some of the other things that have come out. Over 60 studies have reported findings consistent with escalation of porn use, right? Due to tolerance. You view a certain kind of pornography, eventually your brain does not get the same rush that it once did, and you then feel the need to do one of two things: view more of it, or view more deviant forms of it. Or check this out. There are currently 40 studies that link porn use and porn addiction to sexual problems and lower arousal to sexual stimuli. Now, you might say, well, this just shows correlation, doesn't show causation. Well, actually, 7 of these 40 studies do show causation. Why? Because once the one factor of pornography was removed, the people in these studies regained their sexual functioning. So that's pretty good evidence there. We have over 90 studies that link porn use to poorer mental emotional health and poorer cognitive outcomes. So there's just a ton of stuff here. Like check that. This will be the final one we'll look at. There are currently over 80 studies that show a sort of correlation between porn use and relational and sexual dissatisfaction. So even though Pornhub and co. would have you think that responsible adults who are in love use pornography to help spice up their sex life, and this can only be a positive, the science shows something altogether different. The science shows that if you want to remain sexually dissatisfied and frustrated, then pornography is the way to go. In fact, I've heard Jason Everett say, and I think there's truth to this, if you want to shoot your future marriage in the head, pornography is honestly the best way to go about that. All right. Now, many things could be said when discussing how to overcome pornography. We could talk about accountability software like Covenant Eyes, which I highly recommend. We could talk about admitting that you have a problem and taking responsibility for your life. We could talk about a number of things. Honestly, if you're here today and you've really been trying to overcome pornography and you've heard different things that you've found unhelpful, just let me say this very quickly. The 3 things I've seen bear most fruit in the life of somebody who's trying to overcome pornography are spiritual direction, a 12-step group like Sexaholics Anonymous, go to sa.org to learn more, and finding a certified sex addiction therapist, a CSAT therapist in your area. This is what I've found to bear the most fruit. But let me suggest two things that can really help when trying to overcome pornography that you may not have heard of before. Now, I'm trying to think of an analogy here. Imagine a castle. And in order to perhaps repel the enemy or to keep the enemy at a distance, you want to have fortified walls, turrets, these sorts of things. Okay, well, that's one way to think about how to overcome the enemy. But what about if the enemy's gotten through the gate and is coming at you? Well, then the walls aren't necessarily, they're not going to protect you. The turrets might, you see what I mean? But you're going to need some different advice at that point. So I'm going to use that as an analogy for how do I fortify my life against pornography? Okay, that'll be the first thing we talk about. And then I want to talk about what do I do when I'm tempted, right? When the enemy is in the gates, as it were. So in order to do this, I want to show you two slides. The first is what has been called the sobriety plan. A sobriety plan. You see here, we have 3 concentric circles. The outer circle represents healthy habits. The middle circle represents near occasions of sin. And the third, the interior dot there, represents a sexual fall. Now, very often, when we engage with our accountability partners, hopefully you have one if you're a man or a woman struggling with pornography, somebody in your life who loves you and is calling you up to be a sort of better version of yourself, as it were. We usually, unfortunately, though, only talk about our falls. We'll call them up and say, hey, I messed up. I looked at pornography. Ah, man, I'm so sorry. Ah, thank you. Yeah, I'll pray for you. Thanks so much. I'll check in on you a couple of days, Well, that's better than nothing. But with this sobriety plan, you're actually going to find a lot more help. And what I would recommend you do is draw this up on a piece of paper, 3 concentric circles. In that outer circle, the healthy habits, I want you to write in those, well, let's do it the other way around, actually, forgive me. Let's begin with the fall. How are the ways that you fall into sexual sin? And you might list them there in that circle: masturbation, pornography, fornication, massage parlors, whatever it might be, adultery. What are those things that are the ways you fall sexually? And it might just be 2, right? It might be pornography and masturbation. It might be more. Okay, write those down. I think those are pretty obvious to your accountability partner. But what might not be as obvious is what should go in this second circle, the near occasions. Now, some of these will be typical, some of them will be less so. But here, I want you to write whatever are those behaviors that when you engage in them, you tend to fall. Or to think of it in the other way around, when you fall to a sexual sin, what is it that was just occurring? What is it that's happened in your life that has led to this? And so this might be things like cruising social media sites. This might be things like seeing a sex scene on a television show and not processing it with my accountability partner. It might mean eating unhealthy for a period of time and not really caring to do anything about it. It might mean not having a strict schedule, so sleeping in too late, going to bed too late, right? I want you to personalize it. It's not just enough to take my examples. You have to think about it. What are those things that when I engage in them, I end up here? So for you, it might be whenever I have 2 or 3 drinks, I kind of lose my sense there, and it's very easy for me to make bad decisions. Okay, write that there. Write that in the second one. Okay. All right. Now, what about the third circle, healthy habits? What are those activities that you need to engage in to live a more beautiful life? They might be things like working out a couple of times a week, or connecting with a friend, or eating well, and being very specific about what you mean. It might mean getting up and going to bed at a very certain time. It might mean going to Holy Mass once a day, or once a week, or praying the Holy Rosary, or something like that. What are those activities that you need to engage in to live a more beautiful life? So for you, if being stressed out is what often leads you to looking at pornography, what are some things that you can do to see to it that you're not stressed out? And that might mean carving out a period of the day for meditation and prayer. That might mean leaving your phone and computer at the office when you come home from the office. But again, this is going to be very specific to you. So what I want you to do is to draw these 3 concentric circles, fill them out as best as you're able, then go to an accountability partner and say, hey, why don't you do the same, and let's chat about this. Because then what happens is you check in once a week, once a month, whatever. And you say, hey, I'm looking at your sobriety plan, and it says here that you said you wanted to do some of this, some of that, less of this, less of that. Are you doing it? No, I do have to get back to that. Okay, well, let's do it, So that could be a much healthier way of thinking of an accountability relationship and facilitating a good accountability conversation. All right, the next thing I want to talk about is the activation sequence. What do I do when I'm being tempted now? Now, what actually happens when I'm tempted now? Well, Dr. Kevin Skinner, who is a psychologist, suggested a activation sequence. And if you look at this here, you can see that there are 7 points. First, we have the stimulus or trigger. Second, we have the emotional response. Third, we have the first thought. Fourth, we have the chemical release. Fifth, we have the body language. Sixth, we have the battle. Actually, this should be called the second thought. I've mistakenly put the first thought there. And then finally, you have the behavior. All right. So we're going to get into that. But before we do, it might be helpful to realize that in order to be triggered by something, and what do we mean by triggered? What do we mean by stimulus? Well, by trigger, I just mean the thing that gets something else happening, right? So for you, what is your trigger? Well, it might be seeing a sex scene on television. It might be being, seeing, maybe even having a computer with not having accountability set up on it yet. But in order to be sort of susceptible to these triggers, it's like we have to be in a particular emotional state, first of all. Right, and so if you're, and this is usually, the acronym is BLAST. If you're bored, lonely, angry, stressed, or tired, right? Blast in American. Bored, lonely, angry, stressed, tired. You're in a much more sort of susceptible state to being triggered by these certain things. And I just gave 2 examples, right? A sex scene. This is an obvious sexual thing that could trigger me to look at pornography. But then I also mentioned a non-sexual thing, a computer without accountability or filtering software. Maybe it's a new phone you get or a new computer that triggers you. There can be many different triggers, and it's really important that you think about what they are for you and then write them down. Okay, so the trigger is what is going to lead to the behavior. Okay, so I think we all know this, right? When we experience a sexual fall, one of 2 things have happened. We were triggered, that is to say the thought got in our head, the motor was going, and then we looked at porn. What we often don't realize is that we have these 5 stages in between these 2 bookends, and by examining them, we can write, as it were, a deactivation sequence. So this is going to entail some serious personal reflection on your part. As I said earlier, it's not enough for me to tell you what to think. This is for you to reflect upon yourself. So what are your triggers? What are they? Write them down. It could be being in a hotel room, because maybe you've acted out sexually in a hotel room before. Maybe it's the sense of anonymity that leads to you acting out. If you've actually been sexually abused in the past, it might have to do with something in that regard. For example, I once heard from a psychologist, somebody she was seeing, this man was turned on by down jackets. Now that sounds really funny, maybe. Why on earth would anybody be turned on or triggered, rather, by a down jacket? Well, because this person was abused as a child and there was a down jacket in the room, and he's somehow made this connection. Now, it may not be that mysterious for you, but you should be writing them down. What are your triggers? And then the second question is, what's my emotional response to the trigger? I might feel anxious. I might feel excited. I might feel curious. Now, this second thing, the emotional response, is coupled with the first thought. So as I'm triggered, I have this thought that is simultaneous with that emotion, right? So I might think to myself, and here's a couple of examples. No one's in the house right now. I could look at pornography, right? And I have feelings of both maybe curiosity and anxiety and excitement and expectation, along with a first thought. So what are your first thoughts? When you are triggered to look at pornography or act out sexually, what is it that you think? right? It could be like, okay, I won't look at any of the bad stuff. I'll just do this right now and then get to confession, Or maybe you've fallen already and you think, well, I'll look at pornography and then go to confession, and I'll look at it again because I already looked at it an hour ago, and so I'm triggered again. So I'll just look at pornography one more time, and that way I get to go to confession, and it's not as embarrassing to say it all in one thing, right? So I'll do that. After the first thought, you have the chemical release. So once you begin to entertain how you will act out sexually, your body begins to prepare for climax. Okay, and I think for me, honestly, just to be honest, when I was a kid, if I felt like I was in trouble, if my parents were upset with me, if I got bad grades and I felt like I was a disappointment in some way, that would be a trigger for me, And honestly, like now, I think for many of us this is the case. What triggers us may be things that triggered us back in the day when we first looked at pornography. So how do I feel now when I feel like people are upset with me, or I'm a disappointment, or I'm failing? Yeah. So that's why it's very important, because then the body begins to prepare for sexual arousal and climax. And if you've been masturbating since you were a child, your body knows what to do. It's almost like Pavlovian conditioning, at this point. So the body begins to prepare for climax. Okay. Now, Dr. Skinner says it's at this point that you have almost certainly hit the point of no return. If you get to that point where the body is essentially doing a chemical dump, right, of different hormones and neurotransmitters that are going wild in the brain, right, the body is now preparing for climax. And at this point, you're probably going to fall. That's what he says. We'll get back to that in a moment. Now, the next thing that happens is the battle, also known as the second thought. And he calls this the brain's backup system, right? It is there so that you do not just slide into a behavior, right? You put on the brakes, as it were, or you are tempted to, as you consider the alternatives. All right, so this is the second thought, which is called the battle, because here you have competing thoughts. Gee, should I really be doing this? Is this something that'll make me happy? I've done this before. It hasn't made me happy then. Why would I think it would make me happy now? Or I don't have to do it. I haven't gone that far. I can still get out of this if I want to. Or it might be things like, I got my kids sleeping in the next room. I don't want to be this kind of mother. I don't want to be this kind of father. This isn't who I want to be. Right? So those would be thoughts against the act, right? But then you're going to have, and that's why it's called the battle, thoughts for the action. Thoughts such as, one more time's not going to hurt. Or I'm not going to go to the really bad stuff anyway. Or I've had a really stressed out week and I kind of deserve this. Like, it's understandable that I'm doing this, right? Or if my spouse was more sexually available, I wouldn't have to do this. But she's not, so I do. Essentially blaming our spouse, you see. Not a cool thing, but maybe something you do. It's really important that we be honest with these things. Again, you're not writing these things down so you can feel better about yourself. No, you're writing these things down to see why it is you've done what you've done and why you continue to do what you do. All right, this is going to be really helpful for you. So maybe even take it to prayer and write it down. Be as thorough as you can. Now, Dr. Skinner says, whatever thought wins, the behavior follows. So if my thoughts for looking at pornography win, this is okay. Like I can just do this just one more time, and gosh, I'll go to confession, and then I'll be done with it. And then I'm going to get covered eyes on my computer. I'm going to get really serious, but just this one more time. If that thought wins out, then you'll do it. It's like your brain authorizing you to do or not to do. And I think that's important to recognize that whenever we do act out sexually, the brain has to authorize that behavior. We come up with some way of justifying this behavior. So it's really important to say, well, what are those thoughts that I have for and against? Now, if I think, gosh, I don't want to do this, I got to stop right now, and I walk away, well, then that thought won, and therefore the behavior ensued, okay, followed. So stimulus or trigger, then the emotional response, first thought, chemical release, body language, the battle or the second thought, and then finally the behavior. I think that if you were to really spend some time with these two diagrams and be very honest about your own experience of the things we've shared, that would go a long way in helping you be free of pornography. I want to close by suggesting some resources that I think will help you tremendously. Okay. The first would be getting my book, The Porn Myth. This is a non-religious response to pro-porn arguments. There's no talk of Christ or sin or confession. There are no scripture verses cited. And I did that because I thought, just like you can make a sort of logical and scientific case against abortion, we could do the same thing against pornography. So there's a lot of research that went into this book. As you can see here on Amazon, 222 ratings, 4.5-star reviews. Pretty proud of that. It's also on Audible if you want to listen to it. Now, what's cool about this book is 100% of the royalties go to help sexually trafficked victims in San Diego. There's a group called Children of the Immaculate Heart who are doing phenomenal work, and 100% of my cut goes to help them. So in getting the book, not only will you be educating yourself, you'll also be benefiting them. So check that out, The Porn Myth. I have to say, I am really proud of that book. It took a lot of time and a lot of research, and we've got great endorsements from neuroscientists and psychologists and former porn performers. So check that out. Okay, then the next thing I would suggest, if you're a man, and then I'll give you suggestions if you're a woman, is my course, strive21.com. Strive21.com. This is a 21-day course that will help you break free of porn. Basically, if you and I could have a coffee for 21 days, what would I say to you over the course of those 21 days? This is what I say. Because you can't say it all at once. It's very difficult. There's a lot to say. And so this will help you take your time to recover from pornography. Now, it's 100% free. And you can be as anonymous as you want. We have over 20,000 men going through the course right now. And so there are many men that you'll be engaging with. This is a really excellent course. It's very well produced. And every day there is a challenge for you to perform. And none of it's too strenuous. We're not saying, give up hot showers or something like that. But we are saying things like, find an accountability partner today before you progress, or whatever. There's 21 challenges, obviously, so there's more than that. Strive21.com if you're a guy. Finally, I would recommend that you check out Magdala Ministries. This is run by a friend of mine who herself struggled with pornography as a child, and she wanted to help other women. And so when you go to Magdala Ministries and sign up, you click join a group here, and then you put in a little bit of information about yourself, and you will be put into a small group, a small video chat group with other women who've also struggled with porn, or who are, and who want to help each other. It's really cool. MagdalaMinistries.org. Magdala, MAGDALA Ministries.org. Please check them out. I want to thank you very much for your time and attention. I hope that this has been a helpful presentation, and may God bless you. And I suppose finally I would say that if you have been engaged in pornography or sexual sin, as a brother who is a sinner, I would beg you to run to the sacrament of confession. Don't wait another day. You have a God who doesn't tolerate you, doesn't look upon you with disgust, but who loves you immensely, who sent his Son to die and rise in order to open heaven under your feet, essentially. He loves you. And he wants to save you from your sin, and he wants to save me from my sin, more than a mother wants to save her baby from a burning building. So please get to the sacrament of confession if you haven't yet, and receive the mercy God wants for you. Thank you so much.